Are we about to see an October surprise? During election years in the United States, the story goes that this month has often seen surprising developments that had a big impact on the presidential race. Are events about to shift the odds in the battle between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump for the presidency of the US? Well, I think the astrology of this month suggests the potential for exactly that. It begins with a solar eclipse, which are events that are always capable of bringing forth the unexpected. And there are other indications, both on the ground and in the sky, that the world's major geopolitical crises may be seeing big escalations. And a full moon in Aries in the middle of the month suggests the possibility of a change in fate for one of the candidates in next month's presidential election. But who is it? Well, you'll have to watch to find out. In this episode of World Astrology Report, I'll break down the major astrological events of the month and explain what they promise both for you and the wider world. So, welcome to another journey into the past to understand the present and the future. I'm your host, Dan Waits, and let's get into this. As usual, we'll begin with a recap of recent events and the astrology that signified them. On the first day of September, Pluto moved back into Capricorn for the final time. Pluto's transit through the sign of established institutions and tradition has seen the revelation of the excesses and corruption of the establishment and those who have benefited most from the current order. One of the key developments I think we can attribute to Pluto in Capricorn, which began in 2008, was the Me Too movement, in which countless women stepped up to reveal the abuse they'd suffered at the hands of powerful men leading powerful institutions. And Pluto's last dip into Capricorn has already brought forth an avalanche of stories on this theme. Hip-hop mogul Sean Diddy Combs was arrested for sex trafficking. Disgraced Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein faced a new charge of sexual assault. The former CEO of clothing giant Abercrombie & Fitch was accused of sexual assaults on scores of young men. And a former CIA officer was sentenced to 30 years in prison for multiple sexual assaults. But this is a global phenomenon. It's certainly not just playing out in the US. September also saw revelations about sexual abuses by the late owner of London's ritzy Harrods department store, Mohammed Al Fayed. And it saw a flurry of abuse accusations coming out in the Indian film industry, as well as in South Korea. And there are surely many more such examples. These are sad and extremely disturbing stories, of course, but the fact that they're coming out and reshaping norms around how people in power should behave is unequivocally a good thing, I think. Pluto is a rough energy, but one that can ultimately have very positive effects. Now, we're currently in the second of this year's two eclipse seasons. I pointed out last month how the lunar eclipse at 25 Pisces directly hit the chart of NATO, which has its ascendant-descendant axis at 25 Virgo and 25 Pisces. And NATO was very much in the news. Right now, there are loud calls in the West, including from the Secretary General of NATO himself, to give Ukraine permission to use advanced long-range missiles, such as the Franco-British Storm Shadows, Germany's Taurus, and US ATACMS to strike deep into Russia. Last month, Russia's President Vladimir Putin said that such a move would mean that Russia was directly at war with NATO, which needless to say is a very worrying development indeed. We'll talk more about this, as well as the dramatic recent developments in the Middle East later in this episode. And lastly, we also saw another assassination attempt on Donald Trump. As I've discussed in other recent episodes, Uranus, the planet of shocks and surprising turnarounds, is still at the midheaven of his chart, and the twists and turns just keep coming. This time, the second attempt on his life came with Mars in Cancer, almost exactly square to the lunar nodes at the point we call the North Bending. Just like the nodes, the bendings are very sensitive points, and any planet there will get an injection of energy. At this time, Mars was conjunct Trump's Mercury in his 12th whole sign house of hidden enemies. Mars in Cancer can bring violence into protected, bounded spaces. Here we saw an attempted attack on Trump's own golf course, a place he presumably thought he was safe. Now, if you feel like I missed an important development in this recap, then just bear in mind, it's simply impossible to cover everything in these videos. And if I've missed something, that doesn't mean I don't think it matters. That said, in my regular live streams for World Astrology Report members, I go into much more detail about how the current astrology is playing out in the world. In the most recent stream, we looked at how the eclipses and Pluto in Capricorn are playing out, and then I answered members' questions on a bunch of interesting topics like the astrology of Germany, techniques for associating the signs with different parts of the world, ingress charts, terms, decans, and much more. If you want to watch that stream, as well as all previous streams and extended ad-free versions of all my videos since May, then please head to www.worldastrologyreport.com and sign up as a member. You'll also get access to the War Room, where a growing community of cool people are talking about world astrology and the issues we get into on this channel. Thanks for listening. Now let's get into this forecast for what promises to be a dramatic month. If you're enjoying this video so far, please do let YouTube and me know that by clicking that like button down there. And please do consider subscribing to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks. On October the 2nd, we'll see an annular solar eclipse at 10 degrees and 3 minutes of Libra. This will be the third and final eclipse in the sign of the Scales, which won't see eclipses again until 2033. Now, eclipses in Libra have to do with the themes of balance, harmony, fairness, relationships, and agreements, among other things. Eclipses are signifiers of the coming of the new and the exit of the old. And so Libra eclipses signify times when agreements, relationships, and balances are created, adjusted, or broken. If we look at the chart for the coming eclipse, we can see that it will be closely conjunct Mercury, the planet of communication, trade, technology, and cleverness. And so those themes will be bound up with the story of this eclipse. And the eclipse is in a fairly close square to a fallen Mars in Cancer, which on a personal level might lend the moment a bit of a harsh edge. The renegotiations coming here will likely be accompanied by a sense of discomfort or even aggression in Cancerian spaces, which, as I said, are bounded domains of care and protection. The ruler of this eclipse is Venus, but she'll be in her sign of exile, Scorpio. And so events at this time might reveal the darker underbelly of situations that appeared to be fair and harmonious. Perhaps that outer harmony was based on glossing over less palatable truths that will suddenly become visible and drive change. Venus is also what we call averse to the eclipse. She's not making a major aspect to it, so in essence, she can't see it. The aversion of the ruler suggests events might not be things you've foreseen and that you don't have much agency to guide how they play out. This eclipse looks more likely to signify unravelings and partings than the forging of new partnerships. Lastly, Venus is in a grand water trine with Mars and Saturn in Cancer and Pisces, so expect this eclipse to stir up powerful feelings and affect bonds with people close to you. Now, at a mundane level, there are various ways to tie an eclipse's effects to certain parts of the world. One of them is by looking at where it will be visible, and we can see that this one will only be fully visible in the south of Chile and Argentina. Another of the ways eclipses can be tied to places is through the geodetic map. This technique divides the world into 12 30-degree slices, each of which is assigned to a particular sign. Talked about this technique much more extensively in my latest live stream for World Astrology Report members, which is available on my site for members right now. The portion of the world assigned to Libra is this one, which includes Alaska and Hawaii in the US and the far east of Russia. That might not strike you as interesting, but consider this. The Maui wildfires in Hawaii came in August 2023, when the first Libra eclipse of this series, 2 months later in October, was coming into effect. Remember, solar eclipses tend to make themselves felt up to 3 months in advance. I also wonder whether the solar eclipse of October may be signaling something challenging around the status or health of the UK's King Charles III, who's currently suffering from cancer. Pluto is currently squaring his natal moon. Solar arc-directed Saturn is very close to a conjunction with his sun, and it seems to me that the next few weeks could be critical for his fight against cancer. I wish him well. But eclipses also signify developments in countries when they hit sensitive spots in their natal charts. The Libra eclipse of October 2023 came at 21 degrees of Libra. This was very close to the ascendant of Israel at 23 Libra, and at this time we saw the Hamas massacre that kicked off the war in Gaza. And I think we're certainly already seeing the effects of October's final Libra eclipse in the Middle East once again. If we look at the natal chart for Israel, we see that it'll be in the same degree as Neptune. In September, we saw an Israeli covert operation that involved planting explosives in pagers and walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah operatives, which were then simultaneously detonated on 2 consecutive days, causing many deaths and hundreds of serious injuries in Lebanon. Remember here, Mercury is conjunct the eclipse. Mercury has to do with technology and cleverness. We can see a Neptunian signature here as well, in the sense that this was a hidden and mysterious operation that Israel hasn't publicly claimed as its own. We also saw the signature of Mars in Cancer, because these explosions went off in homes and all sorts of spaces normally thought to be safe. And unfortunately, the escalation between Israel and Hezbollah that I was worried would come this month appears to be here. Some 500 people were killed by Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon in a single day on September the 23rd. Lebanon is a fascinating country with a tragic recent history. And in the extended version of this video, available exclusively for World Astrology Report members, we look at the astrology of Lebanon and where this country might be heading in the coming decade. But of course, the Levant isn't the only region that's experiencing a devastating conflict right now. One of the others is Ukraine, and there are some signs that we may be about to see an escalation there too. On October the 9th, Jupiter will station retrograde at 21 degrees and 20 minutes of Gemini. If you have a personal planet within a couple of degrees or so of 21 degrees of the four mutable signs, that's Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, and Pisces, you'll likely feel this retrograde station because Jupiter will essentially be stationary at that degree for many days. Jupiter brings growth, expansion, coherence, and optimism, and it will try to bring those things to whichever sign it's in, even in Gemini, where it's seen as debilitated. But Jupiter in Gemini can have a tendency to overpromise or overstretch itself. If your chart is dialed into this retrograde, enjoy its blessings, but also be cautious that you don't take on more than you can handle or overcommit at this time. And bear in mind that what's promised might not quite match your expectations in the end. Jupiter stations retrograde once a year, and this isn't usually a remarkable moment, but there's a particular reason why I'm highlighting it in this episode, and it has to do with the United States and the geopolitical situation. If we look to the Sibley chart, the chart I prefer to use for the United States, we find Mars at 21 degrees and 22 minutes of Gemini. That's just 2 minutes away from the exact Jupiter retrograde station. What could this mean? Well, Mars is found in the 7th house of the Sibley chart, the house of the other, which in the chart of a country refers to allies and enemies, to war and alliances. And here's where things get somewhat ominous, because the last time that Jupiter stationed retrograde at this degree in partile conjunction to the Sibley chart Mars was October the 10th, 1941. Of course, this was very close to the Pearl Harbor attack and the entry of the US into the Second World War in December 1941. Now, on October the 1st of 1941, just as Jupiter was stationing retrograde, in the same degree as Mars in the Sibley chart, came the conclusion of what's referred to as the First Moscow Conference of 1941. This was a meeting in the Russian capital between representatives of the governments of the US, UK, and Russia, who were allies against the Axis powers in the war. At this time, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union was well underway, and the Russians needed help. And the Americans agreed to give it to them in the form of weapons. On October the 8th, very close to the exact station, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt sent the Russian leader Joseph Stalin a message of support. And the next day, FDR asked Congress for authority to start arming American merchant ships in the Atlantic to protect them from German U-boats. On October the 11th, he wrote to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asking that the two allies share research on nuclear weapons. Jupiter is the planet of expansion, but it's also a unifying, supportive influence. That expansive influence was applied to the domain of Mars, the war planet, and so we saw the US providing help to its allies and taking steps to increase its own preparedness for potential conflict. And we're about to see the same astrological signature once again. And so I think we can expect that we'll see the US promising or delivering assistance to its allies in conflicts around the world. And this is likely to apply to two countries in particular, Israel and Ukraine. Israel is seemingly going to war with Hezbollah right now, and it'll expect support from its great patron, the US. Ukraine, for its part, has been asking for permission from its Western allies to use advanced Western long-range missiles to strike targets deep into Russia. The US, UK, and Germany have so far refused, fearing escalation of the conflict. As we've seen, Vladimir Putin has said that he would consider this green light as meaning that Russia was directly at war with NATO. He argues that the Ukrainians couldn't use these weapons on their own. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and US President Joe Biden discussed this issue in mid-September, but no announcement on a change of policy followed. But supposedly, Keir Starmer had intended to press Biden into allowing Ukraine to use the UK's Storm Shadow missiles. I think there's a high chance that this Jupiter retrograde station could signify the US calling the Russians bluff and giving Ukraine permission to use long-range missiles against them. And that, for obvious reasons, has worrying implications. Jupiter will be in the same degree as Mars in the Sibley chart from the 25th of September until roughly a month later on the 23rd of October. So I think this development could come at any time during that period. And unfortunately, there are other things going on in the sky at the same time that don't bode so well. Uranus is currently retrograde, and that means it's going to be conjoining the malefic fixed star Algol once again, as it did in July at the time of the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. The exact conjunction between Uranus and Algol will come on October the 14th, but Uranus will be close to the so-called demon star for the whole month. And so this month does hold the potential for surprising and shocking events of Algol's violent nature. And there are some other strange astronomical events happening in October that are difficult to interpret, but which seem to highlight this month as a special one. From roughly September the 29th to November the 25th, Earth will capture an asteroid called 2024 P25 into its orbit, turning this object into a so-called mini-moon for 2 months. It won't be visible to the naked eye, but at the start of the month, something else might be. A comet, which may also be appearing in the sky and be potentially so bright it'll be visible in daylight. And as if all that weren't enough, a dead white dwarf star, which explodes every 80 years or so, may be about to go nova and create a bright new light in the sky. The star is part of a binary system in the Corona Borealis constellation, aka the Northern Crown. Who wears a crown, literally or figuratively? What does this stellar omen mean for him or her? If you're interested in learning more about this strange convergence of astronomical events, then I suggest you watch this video that I've linked below by my friend Stefan Burns, who runs a super interesting YouTube channel in which he combines commentary on all kinds of astronomical and geophysical phenomena with metaphysics and astrology. Now, I'm not well versed in interpreting these kinds of unusual astronomical events, but as an astrologer, I do of course believe in omens. And these sure seem like omens to me. And so if there were to be an October surprise, well, I wouldn't be surprised. The major geopolitical developments that I flagged in this episode could have consequences that play into the election, or perhaps something happens that's closer to home in the US. On October the 17th, we'll see a full moon in Aries. Full moons mark moments of culmination and revelation. When they take place in Aries, the themes of self-assertion and expression, pioneering, and independence will be part of the story. There's a lot of martial energy around this moon because not only is it ruled by Mars, the Lord of Aries, it's also in quite a close square to Mars, which will be in Cancer. So some of the themes of Mars in Cancer that we've talked about in recent forecasts are going to be brought to the fore here. Mars is in full in Cancer, and so it brings its energetic, assertive, and sometimes violent energies into Cancerian places, which are enclosed spaces of identification, of protection and nurture. Mars in Cancer can feel a little constrained and signify the urge to break out of these kinds of space, or bring discomfort, energetic release, or conflict to them. It can also bring the urge to fight for those who can't fight for themselves. Look out for these themes at the time of this full moon. That said, in this full moon chart, the moon and Mars are in each other's signs, and so are in the state astrologers call mutual reception. This gives a big boost to the strength of these planets and their ability to steer events towards a constructive outcome. Passions may run high, but being yourself and being brave could pay off here. If we turn to the astromap for this full moon, which shows where in the world it'll be on the most powerful points of a chart, the angles, we can see that it'll be on the ascendant when it goes exact through parts of Russia, Central, South, and East Asia. But we can also add a Mars line, which will show us where Mars will be on the angles at the time of the lunation. To give you an example of how this technique of astromapping lunations and looking at Mars lines really does work, in last month's forecast, I pointed out how the Mars line at the Virgo new moon on September the 3rd was running through India, And I said that because Mars in Gemini was square Neptune in that new moon chart, I could see the theme of conflict between faith groups or fake news coming up in that country. And unfortunately, that turned out to be right, because there was a big outbreak of violence between two ethnic groups in Manipur state, one predominantly Hindu, one Christian. And the violence led the government to suspend internet and mobile data services for 3 days to try to prevent the spread of disinformation and rumors and prevent the protesters from organizing. Now let's return to the map for this coming October's full moon. Mars will be on the ascendant and descendant in Russia, and we can also see that it'll be on the midheaven in Central America and parts of the United States, suggesting the possibility for unrest or violence in those places. And there's something else of relevance to the US. As I mentioned on this channel a couple of times before, Uranus is currently conjoining important points in the charts of both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, and this seems to be bringing rapid turnarounds and changes in the election campaign. The full moon in Aries is pretty close to the placement of Chiron in the US Sibley chart. Now, as I outlined in the extended version of my election prediction video, transits to Chiron have repeatedly signified big milestones in women's history in the US, especially when it's been stimulated by outer planets or Chiron returns. And this full moon in Aries is particularly interesting for Harris, because she was born at a full moon in Aries. And this coming full moon is taking place just 3 degrees away from hers. Venus in this full moon chart is in the last degree of Scorpio, a sign of detriment, but she's about to move into Sagittarius, where that debility is removed. One way you could read this placement is as a statement that a woman's position will improve. So what could this mean? Well, if this were the lunation before the election, I'd assume it was speaking directly to the election result in some way. But there's a new moon coming before November the 5th. So it must be telling us about something that happens before the election in the 2-week period after this full moon, which could of course affect the result in turn. One of the more outlandish possibilities, which I've mentioned before, is that President Biden steps down and Harris is installed as president in his place, allowing her to become America's first female head of state before the election even takes place. That would fit with the Chiron signature I mentioned earlier, but there's a saying, if you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. So it may well just be signaling Harris's involvement in an event involving the United States that requires leadership. Perhaps Harris, as vice president, takes a visible and leading role in some event that she's ultimately remembered for. This could be connected to geopolitics or something directly affecting the US that I haven't foreseen. The square from Mars and Cancer suggests it's a moment of action, perhaps involving violence or assertion connected to the homeland. We shall see. But what I can guarantee will happen is Venus will indeed make that switch from the deep waters of Scorpio into the sunnier realms of Sagittarius. As she reaches the last degrees of Scorpio, Venus will make aspects with all 3 of the slowest moving outer planets, Uranus, Neptune and Pluto. She'll oppose Uranus on October the 14th, trine Neptune on October the 16th, and sextile Pluto on October the 17th, just before she enters Sagittarius. This could signify an interesting few days in matters of the heart, or in terms of artistic inspiration, or just for Venusian people in general. Venus opposing Uranus signifies a romantic or friendly encounter with the unexpected. Venus trining Neptune is always a very pleasant aspect for love matters and the imagination, and the sextile with Pluto implies the possibility of some productive, deep emotional excavation work being done here. Remember that Venus will still be in Scorpio, so whatever transpires could have a sense of the rough and raw or unseemly. But as we've seen, on October the 17th, Venus will enter Sagittarius, Jupiter's mutable fire sign. Sagittarius is concerned with truth and the ideal. It's the sign of the preacher, the ideological warrior, and the fearless adventurer and raconteur. Sagittarians like to quest for the truth and to preach that truth to others when they've found it. When Venus is in Sagittarius, social life, romantic life, and friendship, as well as artistic pursuits, are inflected by Sagittarian vision and ideology. This is a time to produce art inspired by principle, to bond with others over common goals and idealistic beliefs, and to take an adventurous, optimistic approach to love life and friendship. But before we go, there's one last thing, and that's the beginning of Scorpio season. On October the 23rd, the Sun enters Scorpio, bringing the end of Libra season with it. And so we enter the month of the year allotted to the nocturnal sign of Mars. In the northern hemisphere, when the sun is in Scorpio, we've reached the middle of the autumn, the time of year when the nights are longer than the days, and are steadily growing even more so. Darkness is triumphing over light here. We're descending to the depths, and the return of the light at the winter solstice is not yet in sight. And so there's a sense of defensiveness with being prepared for the worst that comes with Scorpio. It's a strategic and smart sign associated with psychological insight and the impulse to penetrate beneath the surface to behold the truth hidden below. As a water sign, Scorpio is concerned with human relations, with being part of a greater human whole, whether in a couple or a larger collective. It's a sign of abiding in deep relations with others. Think of the bonds that a couple form when they've seen each other in all their human fallibility, or that a company of soldiers feel when they've been to war together. Singer Björk is a Scorpio sun. She's described her work as a singer-songwriter quite simply like this: "What I do is write about how the human being feels." Probably nobody understands this better than the Scorpio. To rewind a little, Mercury will also be spending time in Scorpio in October. It'll ingress into the sign on October the 13th. And so the messenger planet finds itself in this sign of depth, intense connection, and fearless and unflinching scrutiny of human relations. Mercury in Scorpio natives tend to have the ability to give expression to the deeper, fundamental realities of the social world. They're people of deep psychological insight, dogged researchers, and sometimes obsessive but perceptive thinkers. Scorpio season is a time of year when we all, to some degree, get to partake in the Scorpionic view of the world. It's a time to gain clearer vision of our social sphere, of our relationships, and of what makes us and the world tick. So that's it for this month's forecast episode. At this point in the extended section of this video, available exclusively for World Astrology Report members, we take a look at the astrology and outlook for Lebanon, a country with a tragic recent history, which is sadly facing more pain now. Lebanon is a country formed to balance the coexistence of several religious communities. Can it survive an era of dissolution, disharmony, and decentralization? If you enjoyed this video and want to know more about the current geopolitical situation, I suggest you watch this video that I made recently with my frequent collaborator, S.J. Anderson, in which we considered the prospects for global conflict and what it could look like. Thanks very much, and see you next time.